This week we are going to talk about requirements analysis, which include the specifying and modeling of the requirements. Just a reminder of the context. When we are trying to create a software system or a computerized system, we are trying to move from something that is described in a vague, ambiguous language that may include several interpretations into something very specific and no interpretation there. That's exactly one meaning to the actual implementation that we have. So in order to make sure that we are choosing the correct meaning out of all the possible meanings of the descriptions, we need to go through multiple stages of adding more and more specificity as we go. So last week we talked about the requirement elicitation, which is the first stage. Now we're going to talk about the analysis, which is still close to the human language than it is to the implementation. But now we're going to start to add the specificity through modeling. Okay, now we're still not too technical yet, but I'm gonna start to use more technical diagrams and models, but we're still close to the human language. Also, a reminder of the software development life cycle. So the first group of activities here that aim at finding out what needs to be done. So we're still here. We talked about illustration last week. Now we are going to talk about the analysis, but we're still trying to figure out what needs to be done. And then later on, based on what comes out of the requirements engineering process, we start to do the design, which aims at planning how we are going to do it, and then the actual implementation based on the plan. The design is the plan, and then we do the implementation based on that, and then testing for verification, and then it keeps going. Now, when we talk about requirements analysis, in the guide, the business analyst guide, requirements analysis includes specify and model requirements, which describes the practices for analyzing elicitation results and creating representations of those results. If you remember the definition of the requirements that we talked about, that a requirement is a representation of a need, right? Now, in the elicitation stage, we collected information, collected documents, conducted interviews and documented them, collected all what we could have access to as something that we can build our analysis on. So that would be the input to the analysis stage, which is a specify and model. Okay, so analysis, we can split it into two things, specifying and modeling. So specifying is just trying to be clear, and we're trying to be clear through a model. This model could be visual or not, but a model is just a simple representation of the concept that we're talking about. Okay, so we start with the input that is the outcome of the elicitation stage. And then we apply, specify, and model. And then the output is more specific, so requirements specified and modeled. It's just a little bit more specific representation of the requirements. And then there is this part of the process that it doesn't end here. So we created the models that are like the specific requirements or the little bit more specific requirements. Now we need to make sure that the requirements that we modeled are actually what we need to be doing. Okay, so there are two ways to check our requirements: through verifying and through validation. So there are two types of checking here. Okay, so the verify is just to make sure the requirements meet the stakeholders' needs. Okay, so perhaps after you do this analysis, you can meet with stakeholders that you have interviewed and make sure that your understanding is correct. So what you have modeled is actually what they meant to say. Okay, And then the next type of checking is the validation. And in the validation, you make sure the requirements satisfy the business goals. So here you make sure that you understood the stakeholder properly. Here you make sure that what you understood, so let's say you understood properly. Now make sure that what you understood, even though it was proper, even though stakeholders agrees that that's what they meant, now we need to make sure that this is what is needed by the business. Okay, make sure that this is what satisfies the business goals. Because sometimes the stakeholders just express certain desire or certain need, but after you model it and you make it clear, and also when you represent the context and the different types of models, it might become clear that what they thought we wanted is not exactly what meets the business goals. Okay, so that's why we need these two types of checking. Now there is the concept of traceability. Now, traceability is just to make sure that as we go throughout the development process, we can trace back the activities back to the requirements. Now, the requirements, we're gonna start to make more specific requirements. So it would be good to start giving it numbers, like numbering. Okay, you see there are numbers and sub-numbers. And then keep track of all what is going to be built on top of these requirements as you go. Now, we have already established that requirements may change over time. So it's very important to know what was built on that requirement so that when it changes, we know what needs to be updated in the next stages. So if you created a design model, if you started implementation, and then the requirements changed, then you need to go through all what was built on it and make sure that this change has been reflected. Okay, so that includes design, test cases, and then later on when you start implementing, where is this requirement implemented, and so on. Okay, so this is just a simple example of a traceability tool, which is a traceability matrix. You can list the requirements here. Okay, and you you put the stages here as columns, and then every requirement is associated with which artifact in which stage. Okay, so this is just an example. Now, if you have a simple Excel sheet can be useful for traceability, but if you can more sophisticated tool like Conflicts and Jira, that would be even better. We're gonna talk about these Conflicts and Jira later, but the idea is that you need to keep track of, starting from the requirements, everything that builds on it. So it's good to start thinking about it right now because you are about to create the specific requirements. Now there are three types of traceability. Forward traceability, which is starting from an artifact. So let's artifact any item in the project. So let's say document, model, requirement, test cases. That's an artifact. A forward traceability means you're starting from the artifact. You can trace back, or you can tell, or you can find everything that depended on it. Okay. Backward traceability, starting from an artifact, you should be able to find all the artifacts that it depended on. So going backward. Okay, its sources. Okay. The bidirectional traceability is going back and forth. Obviously, bidirectional, it's just a matter of numbering. Okay, you should be able to go from one artifact to figure out how it started, where it came from. Okay, or from an artifact, you should be able to find everything that depended on it. Now, generally speaking, bidirectional would be optimal if you can, but obviously when the system starts to become more and more complex, like traceability becomes more and more difficult, especially when you try bidirectional. So perhaps just the ones that are most important, the artifacts that are most important, or the things that you know that there's a risk of changing later, these are the ones that you can focus on. But you're gonna need a way to manage the complexity of it as the system becomes more and more complex. But generally speaking, bidirectional traceability is optimal if you can. Now, since we are in this stage in the requirements analysis, we're starting to generate the requirements, which is the first specific artifact that we have, then we should plan for the traceability as we go through the analysis stage. Now, one of the models that you might find useful is the glossary model. So, as I mentioned before, a model doesn't necessarily have to be a graphical model or a visual model. It could be word-based model like glossary, for example. So it's one way to reduce the ambiguity of the system. For example, the term car by itself can be an ambiguous term. But if you're working for a car agency, now the term car can have a particular meaning for them as opposed to the term van or crossover or truck. Okay, so when you use that particular definition of the word of the term, you reduce the ambiguity. Okay, so you have a glossary with particular definitions. So when we say car, we are not using an ambiguous term. We're using a specific term that means this particular definition. Okay, if you have like something like Instacart or like Uber Eats, so there is a term driver versus the term shopper. Okay, that word by itself, like if you look it up in the dictionary, it may have different meaning, but for this particular application, the term driver means something, the term shopper means particular thing. Okay, so that particular definition reduces the ambiguity. All right. Now, if multiple terms are used interchangeably, okay, linking them together and put them like perhaps you can use one unifying term or just be clear that these two terms are used interchangeably. So that to limit the possible meanings of these terms. Okay. So a glossary is one of the models that you can find very useful to reduce the ambiguity there. It's something good to start with when you start your analysis. So in the guide, the business analyst guide, you will see that the scope is mentioned as one of the inputs to the modeling process. However, in reality, it is not always very easy to recognize the scope just through the elicitation. Okay, so the elicitation, you may talk with people, stakeholders, they may think that they understand the scope and they can try to communicate it with you, but it's not usually very reliable. It is possible to use one of the models that we're going to talk about next, like the domain model, as a tool that will help you to be more clear about the scope. So if you can identify the scope in the elicitation process, that would be great. But to be more specific about it, you need a more careful look at it once you create the domain model that we're going to talk about.